Hi, welcome everyone to this new seminar in contemporary Marxist theory. We are just back from the picket line and very ready to go back and escalate our strike action against the theft of our pensions, and also to defend our pay conditions and fight against sexist and racist discrimination in UK higher education. We are very happy to be here this evening to discuss a book that has been recently published with Yale University Press, Japhy Wilson's Reality of Dreams, Post-Neoliberal Utopias in the Ecuadorian Amazon. This is a book that discusses the contradictions and limits of Ecuador's citizens' revolution, and also deconstruct the utopian fantasies of the post-neoliberal extractivist state on the one side, but also draws attention to the alternative utopias emerging from below. And to discuss this book and related topics this evening, we have a very interesting group of scholars, starting with Japhy Wilson himself, who is an honorary research fellow in politics at the University of Manchester. And we also have Thea Riofrancos, who is an associate professor of political science at Providence College in the United States. And she will discuss the challenges of social transformation in Latin America, also drawing on her book, Resource Radicals, and her current book in progress, Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism. And the third speaker is Mazen Labban, who is based at Rutgers University. He's a Marxian political ecologist who wrote another book on related topics, space, oil and capital, and he's also one of the editors of Capitalism, Nature and Socialism. So our plan for today is to have about 15-minute presentation by the three speakers, and then start a discussion. So Japhy, if you want to kick off, please go ahead.
Okay, hi, can everyone hear me? Great. Okay, so first of all, thanks very, very much to the seminar for inviting me, and particularly to Tom Purcell, my old buddy from Ecuador, as I'll mention a bit later. And huge thanks to Mazen Labban and Theoria Francos for agreeing to participate. Mazen was actually one of the reviewers for the original manuscript. I provided an absolutely superb review, which ended up really massively changing the final work. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing his thoughts on how it turned out. And Thea's work is obviously brilliant and has been very influential. And her book Resource Radicals treats themes similar to the ones that I address from a different perspective, and is a superb book. So it's really wonderful for me to have you both here to offer your thoughts. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes. Forgive me if I go a couple minutes over. It's a bit of a challenge to try to summarize a book in the space of a quarter of an hour, but I'm going to give it my best shot. And in the interest of trying to be as concise as possible, I'm going to read the text. This is the book, by the way. Seems to be back to front as it appears on my screen, I'm not sure. Okay, so. Dreams are transformed into reality with the citizens' revolution. This was the slogan of the government of Rafael Correa, who was elected president of Ecuador in 2006 on a radical economic platform which promised an end to the deepening poverty, widening inequality, and unbridled ecological destruction that had characterized the disastrous neoliberal experiment of the previous 25 years. His election marked a further victory for a wave of post-neoliberal governments sweeping to power across South America in response to the continental crisis of free market capitalism, which included the regimes of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Néstor Kirchner in Argentina, and Lula in Brazil, among others. Following his election, Correa joined Chavez and Morales in the construction of a 21st century socialism, which would challenge the very structures of the capitalist system. A new constitution was ratified in 2008, becoming the first in the world to enshrine the rights of nature. The constitution was centered on the Quechua indigenous principle of sumac causai, or buen vivir, good living, which rejected capitalist development as a neo-colonial imposition inconsistent with indigenous practices and cosmologies. Over the course of the following decade, these principles would inspire an economic project that aims to overcome the nation's socially and economic and environmentally catastrophic dependence on Amazonian oil reserves. By reclaiming control of its natural resources from transnational corporations, Ecuador would mobilize the financial resources of a global commodities boom to catalyze a transition from the finite resources of the oil industry to the infinite resources of a collective knowledge economy based on the unparalleled biodiversity and genetic wealth of the country's Amazonian ecosystems. My book explores a series of utopian infrastructural megaprojects financed by this bonanza of petrodollars. It is based on extensive field research, the majority of which was undertaken between September 2014 and December 2015, when I was working for the National Center of Strategies for the Right to Territory, CENIDET, according to its acronym in Spanish, an Ecuadorian state-funded research institute directed by the Marxist geographer David Harvey, of which Thomas Purcell of King's here today was the assistant director. CENIDET was established by members of the Correa administration with the stated aim of providing policy advice to the planning ministry, training civil servants in radical social theory, and contributing to the construction of the so-called socialism of buen vivir. Our location within the state ensured unprecedented access to politicians, bureaucrats, planners, and internal documentation, and provided a unique perspective on the unfolding of a utopian experiment. When I arrived in Ecuador, I was aware of the critiques that were by then emerging of the citizens' revolution from the indigenous and environmentalist left regarding the regime's continued reliance on resource extraction and its repression of indigenous resistance. But I was also aware of the celebrations of its modernizing achievements by more traditional leftist sectors, and was optimistic about working with Harvey, Tom Purcell, and the rest of CENIDET in contributing in some small way to maximizing the progressive potential of the government. However, as our research progressed, it became clear that the opposition between these two leftist factions was missing a crucially important point. The decolonial and ecological left understood the citizens' revolution as a totalizing and destructive neo-colonial imposition, while the modernizing and statist left framed it as a triumph of developmental progress. Despite their ideological opposition, both therefore represented the citizens' revolution as a meticulous developmental project devoted to radical modernization. It's just that the decolonial and ecological left saw this as problematic, while it was celebrated by the modernizing and statist left. In doing so, they overlooked what Michael Taussig calls, quote, the massive degree of uncertainty, bluff, and ignorance on which such gargantuan enterprises as the ship of state rest. The central chapters of my book draw this underlying chaos to the surface through an exploration of 3 utopian megaprojects constructed in the Ecuadorian Amazon: the Manta-Manaus Interoceanic Corridor, the Millennium Cities, and a biotechnology university called ICIAM. In this talk, I will briefly outline the fate of each of these projects. And I was then going to go into the theoretical and methodological dimensions of the book. Won't have time to do that. I'll just offer a few final reflections, indications of what my overall argument is. And this will hopefully raise some issues for us to discuss regarding the relationship between capitalism and utopia, and how to think and write about such questions from a critical perspective. So just to summarize then these 3 mega projects and how they played out in reality. The Manta-Manaus multimodal transport corridor aimed to compete with the Panama Canal by opening an interoceanic corridor from the Pacific coast of Ecuador to the industrial city of Manaus in the Brazilian Amazon and on to the Atlantic coast of Brazil. This was central to the larger project of shifting Ecuador's position within global production networks from primary commodity production, principally oil, to high value-added industries, Over $1 billion was invested by the Correa administration in the highways, ports and airports included in the Ecuadorian section of the corridor. However, the road over the Andes ran into a maze of canyons and had to be abandoned. The river Napo, along which the fluvial section of the route would run, was found to be too shallow for commercially viable vessels, and the new airports were virtually unused. The outcome was a total absence of international trade moving along the corridor. To my knowledge, not one single container ever made the journey. Meanwhile, the port on the Napo, at which containers were to be shifted from road to river, was repurposed by the oil industry as the closest port to a controversial new oil block that Correa had opened in the Yasuni National Park. Now to the second of the 3 mega projects. The Millennium Cities were a planned network of 200 new towns to be constructed throughout the Ecuadorian Amazon, in which the indigenous inhabitants of the region would be resettled, and where they would finally benefit from the oil extracted from beneath their territories. In a microcosm of the leftist dichotomy between the celebration of the progressive potentials of the developmental state on one hand, and the condemnation of extractivist violence and dispossession on the other, Correa and his opponents on the anti-extractivist left clashed over the project. Correa insisted that he was bringing modernity to impoverished and marginalized citizens, while his critics accused him of launching a colonial project for the seizure of indigenous territories and the erasure of indigenous cultures. These opposing discourses paradoxically collaborated in the projection of a vision of an omnipotent and totalizing state. But the first 2 Millennium Cities turned out to be mere mirages of modernity: schools without teachers, clinics without doctors, roads without cars, which were being rapidly abandoned by their inhabitants and consumed by the jungle, and in which the state was dramatically failing to pursue its supposedly civilizing project. Following the collapse of the oil boom in 2014, these 2 initial cities continued their decline, and only one more of the 200 that had been planned was actually constructed. In other words, of the 200 planned cities, only 3 were ever completed. And now to the third of the 3 mega projects. Iquiam was envisaged as a state-of-the-art biotechnology university on the edge of an extensive Amazonian biosphere reserve, in which scientists would research the flora and fauna of the jungle, unlocking its economic potential and catalyzing a green transition from an economy based on oil extraction to one based on knowledge and biodiversity. The planning for the university began in 2012, with its inauguration scheduled for 2014. A team of international scientists were assembled for the planning phase and insisted that the timeframe was completely unrealistic, from starting the planning to opening the university within the space of less than 2 years. But in the words of one of the architects of Iquiam, the response from Correa's team was, quote, "There is no time, build the fucking thing now." Both the scientists and Correa's team were proved right. It was completely unrealistic, and there was no time. By the time the main campus was inaugurated in October 2014, the oil price had begun its precipitous descent. The budget was repeatedly slashed as a result. Laboratories and entire campuses remained unbuilt, and scientists began appropriating indigenous knowledges, in other words, biopiracy, in the absence of facilities in which to conduct their own research. Meanwhile, budgetary shortfalls were being desperately compensated by an aggressive and increasingly privatized expansion of the primary commodity frontier. Needless to say, Correa's dream of a knowledge economy did not come to fruition. Most of the developmental gains of the citizens' revolution were eroded in the sustained collapse of the oil price over the following years. By the end of 2017, Ecuador had returned to neoliberal orthodoxy. This perplexing situation presented me with an unanticipated theoretical challenge: how to make sense of things that don't make sense. According to the dominant critical approaches to utopian social engineering, exemplified by James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State, James Ferguson's Anti-Politics Machine, and Henri Lefebvre's The Production of Space, such grandiose state plans invariably fail both despite and because of the scale of their ambitions. But in the case of the Citizens' Revolution, it turned out that there was no plan. The Millennium Cities were delivered to their inhabitants without a development plan or a management structure, and ICIAM had been launched in the absence of a national technology strategy or a local territorial plan. A team of technocrats at the planning ministry was working on a master plan for the Amazon. But when I asked them about the fluvial port that would supposedly complete Manto Manaus, the interoceanic corridor, but which was in fact being repurposed by the oil industry, they looked at each other blankly. They had never heard of the project, despite the fact that they were the ones in charge of the master plan, of which it was supposedly a key component. These apparently monolithic plans weren't failing because of their totalizing abstraction from local particularities, as the critical literature on such projects had led me to assume. They weren't really plans at all, and the cities and highways produced in their name weren't strategies of top-down domination. They were modernist mirages, spectacular fakeries, absurdist incongruences grafted onto the overwhelming material dynamics of the Amazon. The book documents my attempts to come to grips with this baffling scenario. What could explain this immense surge of utopian visions and projects? How could I make sense of the farcical extent of their failure? What lessons did this hold for the possibility of post-neoliberal and post-capitalist transformation? And what might all this tell us about the relationship between dreams and reality in the capitalist production of space? These remain the central questions that animate the book, but as my perplexity increased over the course of my research, I gradually concluded that the quest to get a grip on a nonsensical reality and to make sense of the senseless was precisely the temptation to be resisted. Too often, in our eagerness to explain the world, we set aside the most incongruous elements of our findings and emphasize those that fit our frameworks. We make sense, in other words, of things that don't make sense. In doing so, we unwittingly perform the task of the ideological state apparatus by retroactively projecting greater coherence onto social reality than it in fact possesses. In this book, I have ended up taking a different approach by seeking to make sense of the fact that things don't make sense, and by attempting to make room for the fantastical and nonsensical within the space of explanation. Now I'm just coming to my last paragraph now. Rather than immediately dismantling the failed Amazonian utopias of the citizens' revolution, I attempt to capture the enchantment of their immediate appearances, to convey my bewilderment when confronted with their farcical dimensions, and to unfold the contorted process of their failure in ways that trace the path of my own perplexed investigations. In doing so, I seek to avoid projecting more coherence onto reality than it possesses, consistent with the principle of making sense of the fact that things don't make sense. Rather than editing out the remarkable catalogue of incongruencies and irrationalities that I encountered in my research, the book lingers over the preposterous plans, extraordinary errors, and intractable bureaucratic labyrinths that constitute these farcical megaprojects. This accumulation of anomalies serves to disrupt the slick self-representations of the post-neoliberal state. What I aim to show, in short, is this. In the context of commodity booms, like the oil boom that fueled the citizens' revolution, value miraculously appears in the form of natural objects, which are alchemically transformed into money. As the controller of these resources and the extractor of these rents, the state is endowed with the seemingly occult power to produce spectacular infrastructures that combine the commodity fetish of natural resource wealth with the utopian dream of instant modernity. But the end of the boom marks a jarring shift from the phantasmatic to the absurd, as these monuments to progress are revealed as highways without traffic, universities without laboratories, cities without people. The state, which had towered over society with a seemingly monolithic omnipotence, is shown to be a ramshackle contraption, cobbled together from fragmented and dysfunctional institutions, and fitfully spitting out half-baked schemes and hyperbolic slogans. And its representatives, who only yesterday were the heroic conductors of a magical dream machine, are exposed as charlatans and imposters, scrambling to maintain a semblance of coherence and control, as their dilapidated machinery is dismantled by the very hidden forces that have been holding it together. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Japhy. Our next speaker is Thea. Please go ahead, Thea. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's a hard act to follow. Fascinating presentation, Japhy, and I have so much more to say than what I wrote in my comments, but I'll save it for the conversation afterwards for now, to not go over time. So I think there'll be some resonance between what Japhy said and what I said, though maybe we're operating at slightly different planes, and my comments will be maybe a smidge more abstract from some of that wonderful detail that Japhy got into, but hopefully they'll prove useful. So I'm going to zoom out a lot from maybe where we just landed, and say that the kind of overarching theme of my work over the past several years is that resource extraction poses a set of sometimes seemingly intractable dilemmas for the left. These dilemmas are particularly acute for movements and governments in the global south, but I would argue that their remit is planetary. For the left everywhere, the extractive foundations of global capitalism require urgent transformation to avoid the worst of climate crisis. But as I'll discuss kind of briefly at the end of this talk, renewable energy is of course not the end of extraction. From this perspective, a quote, greener capitalism is not a more sustainable one, and thus itself poses a new set of challenges to left program and strategy around the world. I first want to begin with the dilemmas of extraction facing global South movements and governments. In my book, Resource Radicals, I diagnose two sets of these dilemmas. So I'll try to keep this organized so it's clear, pertaining respectively to the left in power, so that, you know, magical modernizing government that Japhy just discussed, but more broadly across the pink tide, and the left in resistance. So those are those on the ground anti-extractive social movements on the front lines of extraction. I too kind of focus on Ecuador here, but I think the parallels are quite clear with not just Latin America, but across the global South. So for both segments of the Ecuadorian left, the left in power, the government, and the left in movement, the vexing challenge of how to respond to an extractive model of accumulation issues from the very uneven territoriality of extraction itself, an unevenness that unfolds at multiple scales. Globally, so at the sort of planetary scale, some countries more than others are relegated to the position of raw material exporters. Within national borders, so at the national scale, some populations, territories, and ecosystems are sacrificed and converted into extractive frontiers. And at the most granular local level, the class, ethnic, racial, and gender hierarchies of the extractive economy reproduces its constitutive unevenness. This unevenness is the setting in which transformative left projects unfold and, as Japhy very elegantly argued, so often meet their limits. So I'm going to start with a synthetic overview of what I take to be the core contradiction for the left in power and then for left movements, and then I'll delve a bit more into each. So for left governments, which are trapped in a world system predicated on unequal economic and ecological exchange, and governed by political and economic institutions that reproduce neocolonial hierarchies, the uneven territoriality of extraction is an impediment to the ostensible goals of left governance, national or even regional sovereignty, transformative redistribution, and anti-imperialism. For left movements, the uneven territoriality of extraction fragments the popular sectors that are their social bases, exposing some but not all to the immediate and social and environmental harms of an extractive model of development, reinforcing divides between rural and urban, indigenous and mestizo, and between those with livelihoods relatively external to versus deeply enmeshed in these circuits of extractive sectors. So right away, I want to flag that this could seem like a deterministic argument, that I'm arguing that the geography or geology of an extractive model of development inevitably has certain political effects. But it's not a deterministic argument. The uneven and unequal territoriality of oil, mining, and other extractive sectors doesn't automatically produce political subjects or positionalities. It's politically mediated all the way down. So a key piece of evidency for the political mediation of the effects of extractive development is the very historical trajectory that I trace in the book. wherein Latin American, and here specifically Ecuadorian, popular struggles against extraction shifted rather dramatically from a position that I call radical resource nationalism, which is perhaps a more familiar or traditional left position targeting the ownership structure and relations of production of extractive sectors, demanding worker, state, democratic, popular-owned extraction in the place of extraction governed by multinational capital. A shift away from that position to one that embraced militant anti-extractivism, which opposes extraction to court. More generally, the very division of the Ecuadorian left into two mutually opposed camps with distinct responses to extraction that Japhy already laid out, a progressive government that embraces extraction as a source of revenues for other political and economic projects on the one hand, and an anti-extractive left that opposed, that left-wing government's plans, was itself the result of a complex interplay between political contingency and obdurate extractive materiality. That is something I argue in the book that I won't evidence here, but I guess trust me for now. Now let me return to each of the snapshots that I laid out above. And I think exploring these dilemmas also shows the political mediation of extraction. So I'm not going to go through the historical argument, but perhaps the more conjunctural argument also shows that geology and geography aren't destiny at the same time that they are the grounds in which left projects unfold. So let's start with left governments. Extraction presents left governments with what I call a double-edged sword. A sword that's particularly sharp in moments of a commodity boom, which was exactly the global economic setting in which pink tide of left governments took power in Latin America. And I'm happy if we want in Q&A to discuss what I think current commodity market dynamics pose for the new crop of left-wing leaders that have been recently elected around the region. So what is this double-edged sword? In the short term, it is obvious, and again, I'm sort of resonating with some of what Japhy said. In the short term, extractive development provides revenues, so-called easy revenues or resource rents that can fund social services and public infrastructure. This obviously buoys popular support because by spending money on what anti-neoliberal social movements long demanded, the state, ensures a kind of electoral constituency. It also buoys political support for another reason, which is that it avoids class conflict. So it sort of, let's say, buys through social services and public infrastructure the political support of a sort of more mass constituency. And I don't mean buys in terms of pure co-optation or rentierism, but just literally by addressing economic needs. But for the ruling class, the sort of dynamic is a slightly different one. What commodity booms allow is redistribution without structural change. They allow left-wing governments to pay for all of these needed services and infrastructures without taking the wealth or even income of the rich, thereby avoiding a class conflict that could mire and ultimately destroy those left-wing governments. So that's the short-term benefit, but also the compromise. In the medium term, though, there's always going to be a commodity bust. It's just a matter of when. In the case of the commodity boom from 2000 to 2014, it was a relatively long boom, but the bust was quite dramatic, starving leftist governments around the region of needed economic resources and therefore political legitimacy. And in the longer term, and this maybe gets more closely connected to where Japhy was going, there are the contradictions of a post-extractive transition. How do you go from extraction to post-extraction? What I observed in Ecuador, similar to Japhy, was this perennially deferred transition. Like, we're going to use the resources from oil and mining to fund this knowledge economy, but the knowledge economy never comes. Okay, let me now go to movements. So anti-extractive movements also face a double-edged sword. On the one hand, and this is the sort of positive of the political opening that the uneven territoriality of extraction affords to movements, which is that the directly affected, or more bluntly, the directly harmed by extraction communities that are on the front lines of extraction are also on the front lines of a key choke point of global capitalism that they have the leverage and capacity and strategic location to disrupt. And they also, their activism is potentially imbued with a democratic and even moral claim to be able to have some control over their immediate surroundings, right? And so they can claim, we are directly affected by extraction, therefore we have a right to stop it so that we can have non-extractive livelihoods. Sort of the uneven territoriality of extraction allows for the mobilization of those directly affected by it. But the flip side of that is that it is challenging to mobilize broader popular sectors, urban and peri-urban masses, who in the short term, just as their governments might politically and economically benefit from extraction, also may benefit through the receipt of those social services and public infrastructures that they were long denied under neoliberal governments. So if there is a short-term benefit to a large segment of the popular classes, it is challenging to recruit them into anti-extractive struggle. So there is therefore a sort of delimiting or fragmentation of the left coalition. And now I'm going to sort of transition into the final part of my talk. And so I might even shave off a little time and leave some more for discussion, which is that, we are currently globally at the crossroads of an intensifying climate crisis, a renewable energy transition that is itself unevenly unfolding, and increasingly tense geopolitics. Of course, the situation in Ukraine is an obvious example of this, with its own extremely clear implications for global energy markets. So at this crossroads of climate crisis, renewable energy transition, and geopolitics, there's a kind of new set of dilemmas of extraction for the left. And I kind of suggest, to fellow comrades and colleagues that we sort of confront these dilemmas head on, lest we be, prematurely defeated by the forces of what we might call green capitalism. So the dilemma manifests in one way for anti-extractive movements, which is first and foremost that they are called to fight on multiple and kind of, in a way, temporally distinct fronts, one a bit backwards looking, the other a bit forwards looking, right? So on the one hand, anti-extractive struggle continues against the stubborn power of fossil capital in all of its, infrastructural tentacles, rigs, offshore platforms, coal mines, pipelines, power plants, LNG terminals, oil and coal railroads, and more, right? So the physical manifestations and their harm of fossil capital are everywhere, and, investment continues to flow to fossil capital. And so this is a key battlefield. But there's another battlefield that's emerging and growing, and maybe is a bit more forward-looking, which is the extractive zones linked to the renewable energy transition: lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel, rare earths, and much more. These are the raw material inputs to a so-called clean, green technologies and the renewable energy transition that they underwrite. So the core dilemma here is perhaps an obvious one, and relates very directly to the uneven spatiality that I discussed earlier, which is a seeming, and I want to emphasize seeming, right, because we're not in the realm of inherent laws, but a seeming trade-off between flourishing ecosystems, landscapes, and communities on the one hand, versus rapid action on climate via the mass deployment of green technologies like electric vehicles, wind turbines, and solar panels, all of which have extractive supply chains that harm communities on their front lines. I say a seeming trade-off because I do think that the reality is more complex. First of all, communities on the front lines of the transition-related extraction are also on the front lines of the climate crisis. These are not two opposed crises for them, but rather, deeply imbricated in their everyday reality. And in addition, there is more than one way to organize a renewable energy transition, with really dramatic implications for the level of resource intensity and therefore the consequences for extractive zones. So there are ways to mitigate the trade-off or tension between rapid climate action via green technologies on the one hand, and the protection of local biodiversity and livelihoods on the other, but it would entail a really different type of energy transition than the hegemonic prevailing approach that we see unfolding before us. But I want to note that there's a couple of other challenges, and I'll kind of end here, which don't just have to do with that extraction climate trade-off or seeming trade-off, but have to do with how the map of extraction, so that spatiality that I've kind of has been a theme of my comments, is shifting in real time, and in ways that I myself would not have predicted a few years ago when I began studying lithium in the desert of Chile, which is where my current project started. Since I started researching this in early 2019, we see this interesting spatial shift where states in the global north, so I'm referring specifically to the United States and the European Union, as well as European Union member states, are encouraging onshoring of so-called critical minerals with, in a context of what they perceived of geoeconomic conflict with an ascendant China. So in the sort of current geoeconomic scenario, global North governments want to, quote, dominate supply chains, and those supply chains begin with mining. And so in this context, global North governments have actually encouraged lithium extraction, exploration, investment within their borders. This does not mean that there's no extraction in the global South. Of course not. What it means is that the total extractive pie is growing. So we have global North onshoring alongside continued extractive predation in the global South. What does this mean for global solidarity? How can movements for climate, environmental, and indigenous justice avoid being pulled in different directions, from an emphasis on climate to an emphasis on preserving local biodiversity? And, what are the challenges for global solidarity in a world in which extraction seems to be happening at an increasingly planetary scale, troubling some of our distinctions between global North and South at the same time that global inequalities are deeply reproduced? And then finally, maybe, the big question of what would a more globally and environmentally just and therefore less extractive energy transition look like? I have provisional answers to these questions, but they're live questions that I think require collective debate and analysis. So I'm going to leave them as questions and turn it over to Mazen and then to the Q&A.
Please, Mazen, go ahead.
Can you hear me fine?
Yes, yes.
First, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this seminar. It's good to see old friends and hopefully new ones. I wasn't planning on reading this book now because like most of you, I have 1001 missed deadlines, and because, as Japhy mentioned, I read it not long ago in manuscript form. But I'm glad that I got to read it again because, as you know, when you read a manuscript, you're obsessed with one thing, which is to help it see the light, especially if it's really a very good manuscript and the author is a comrade. But when you read the book, the book is done. You can't do anything about it anymore. You can take more time to argue with it or converse with it, and you can, above all, enjoy it. And I really enjoyed reading this book. I enjoyed it too much. In fact, I had to remind myself I was reading it for a seminar, and that I had to get back to work and put down some notes. It's a very rich book, but it's also very beautifully written. It's very engaging. And it's very infectious, although it doesn't have a single picture in it. The evocation of the place and the processes and the mood is so strong that one is really transposed with Japhy as he goes along the transportation corridor during in the Amazon. Now the book is really too rich to pin down in 15 minutes or even in one seminar. So I will focus on one line of argument, an experimentation of sorts, and see where this takes us. Now, I have a tendency to digress, so I'm going to read my remarks in the interest of keeping my contribution to under 15 minutes. I read Reality of Dreams as a treatise on extractive capital that is not about extraction per se, but around it in two ways that make it exceptionally interesting. It is about one state's failed attempt to extricate itself from its entanglements with the transnational circuits of extractive capital. And it is about the circulation of extractive capital beyond extraction proper in what Harvey calls the primary, secondary, and tertiary circuits of capital. Investments in production and consumption, investments in the built environment, investments in science and the production of knowledge, and social expenditures on the reproduction and repression of workers or labor power in a more abstract way. Education, health, but also the ideological and repressive state apparatuses. There are no strict boundaries between the circuits, of course. They intersect and overlap. All of them involve investments in the built environment, most of which has multiple uses. Knowledge is appropriated as means of production, and cities function as means of reproducing labor power, so on and so forth. And although Harvey proposes the three circuits to explain switching capital from one circuit to another as a short-term solution to accumulation crises, capital circulates in all of the three circuits simultaneously. The three mega projects that Japhy dissects in chapters 3 to 5 of the book are apt illustrations of the three circuits, their simultaneity and intersections. The Manta-Manaus corridor, Millennium Cities, and ECAM, and other universities plan to exploit the biodiversity of the Amazon and the production of bio-knowledge and ultimately biotechnology. That all of them failed to achieve their intended purposes, which is to liberate the petrostate from its dependence on hydrocarbons, connects the second point directly to the first one, the failed attempt to liberate the state from extractive capital. Reality of Dreams extends this framework by introducing a fourth circuit that permeates the three circuits but constitutes a circuit of its own, the circuit of fantasy, the circulation of capital as value in process and its reproduction through the circulation of fantasy through the three circuits of capital and independently of the other circuits. I emphasize the latter point, the independent circulation of fantasy, because this is where capital operates as an apparatus of capture and inadvertently reconstitutes processes that resist and escape its capture. I will get to that point in a minute, but I want just to mention a note on the terminology. The book brims with different terms: dreams, fantasies, phantasmagorias, utopian visions, utopian fantasies, fantastic utopia, so on and so forth. And I know that this is consistent with the refusal to make sense of that does not make sense, but some conceptual clarity perhaps to aid the reader could have helped, and maybe Japhy would return to this point in the discussion later. The circuit of fantasy, like the other circuits which are set in motion by the accumulation of oil rents, the fourth circuit of fantasy also springs from the promise embodied in hydrocarbon wealth, the utopian visions and dreams of prosperity, abundance, autonomy implied in the promise of oil. And this fantasy is not exclusive to the petrostate, but is shared by, seeps into several social strata: mad entrepreneurs, oil workers, colonos, the early colonizers of the mestizo colonizers of the Amazon, and the indígenas, the indigenous communities inhabiting the Amazon. Indeed, the book is somewhat composed of two sections. Chapters 1 and 2 recount the fantasies that spurred the early colonization of the Amazon in the modern era, the utopian visions of the poor and the dispossessed, oil workers, landless peasants, enslaved indigenous people, the dreams of the subaltern populations that were animated by and carried within them the dynamics of capital accumulation, and which functioned ultimately to deepen those dynamics and provide them with a new foundation. Chapters 3 to 5, on the other hand, recount the utopian fantasies of the post-neoliberal state, the citizens' revolution, the dream of independence from the limits of finite resources, and the biosocialist utopia fueled by the infinite resources of bio-knowledge and the abundant biodiversity of the Amazon. Fantasy, Japhy argues and insists, is not the opposite of reality. Fantasy infuses and permeates lived social material reality and plays a crucial role in its production, structuring, and framing. Fantasies fail when they encounter what Japhy, following Zizek, calls the real of capital, the constitutive antagonisms of capitalist society that determines what goes on in social reality, but is excluded from our spontaneous experience of social reality. Exclusion that is ensured by social fantasies, like utopian socialism or the citizens' revolution, which is a species of it. By a series of paradoxical inversions, some fantasies that conceal within them the real of capital end up reproducing the social conditions they intended to transcend. In this case, the deeper dependence of the state on hydrocarbons and mineral rents, the colonial processes of dispossession, displacement, and exclusion. If you don't have time to read the whole book, I suggest that you read the chapter on IKEAM, the Mirage Laboratory, chapter 5, which also is the longest chapter, but it is really, this chapter captures all the processes that Japhy tries to tease out of his experience of the citizens' revolution. I want to shift things around a little bit in the spirit of experimentation and introduce a third term into the dialectical relationship between utopian fantasies and the real of capital, and recast it as an opposition between what Deleuze and Guattari call desire on one side and fantasy on the other. Desire, or desiring production, is the continuous creative life force that produces social reality in the sense of constructing the material world, but also making connections among things, producing arrangements, ensembles, multiplicities, and communities. Can think desire as what the young Marx calls life activity, productive life itself, life engendering life. That is the free life producing activity invested with libidinal energy, which capital separates from its species character and alienates as labor. It is the continuous flow of desiring production that produces and directly invests social reality, and in the process produces itself. Instead of the destruction of fantasy by the real of capital, as Japhy argues, I want to propose an interruption of the flow of desiring production by fantasies, dreams, utopian visions, embodying and animated by the real of capital. Desire as creative process or activity is not destroyed, only interrupted, blocked, and captured by fantasy. Fantasy brings desiring production to a halt, freezes it, but in doing so, it makes different arrangements possible. Desire is then reconstituted, its components rearranged, and continues to flow again, and so on and so forth, such that it is never permanently trapped in any particular object or representation, like the mega projects that are presented in this book. That is, desire cannot be permanently repressed, completely subsumed under capital. Something always escapes the apparatuses of capture, and what escapes is always something different. This is, I think, as close as I can get to what Japhy refers to as insurgent utopia, the vitality of an insurgent utopia, which emerges from the gap between fantasies, or as I see it, desire which escapes the trap of fantasy in a reconstituted form. This is how I read the opposition between the aspirations of the subaltern social groups that have colonized the Amazon since the 1960s and the communities that have lived there since time immemorial, and the fantasies and the utopian visions of the post-neoliberal state as an opposition between flows of living desire and blocks of dead fantasies, the mega projects that realized, crystallized the collective dreams of the citizens' revolution. Put differently, the state as dream machine captures the flow, and this is Japhy's term, by the way, captures the flow of those vital desires, the energies of popular discontent, in the very process of freezing them into the fantasies by exploding them into a hallucinatory scale. I would like to talk about this more in the discussion. You know, blowing up a simple demand into something that is impossible to realize as a way of actually blocking it. There are many examples from the book, but the most poignant perhaps is the Millennium Cities as representations of the violent repression of the prohibited desire, the struggle for the creation of an indigenous oil company, which ironically itself turned out to be a scam, an immense dream that blocked the desire for indigenous autonomy and collective control of oil in indigenous territory. The comunas accepted the cities as a compensation for their doubly blocked aspirations, that the cities were themselves a sham, uninhabitable stage sets underlies their functions as apparatuses of cooptation, repression, and capture. But they would have served the function even if they have worked as intended, or even if they were not built at all. The realization of utopian fantasies is at once their negation. They appear to die the moment they come true or materialize. Utopian fantasies face the danger of their involution in the process of their own realization, under the same conditions of their emergence. They could be said to fail in that respect, but they succeed in their function as blocks to the vital creative capacities and activities that constitute and reconstitute material reality. As the wave of Paros demonstrates, especially in 2005, those interruptions are never permanent. They make possible new arrangements, compositions, ensembles, not entirely spontaneous, but neither rigidly organized, open-ended, flexible, malleable, and continuously shifting in form. Insurgent utopias is what emerges from this dual process of interruption and involution. They emerge or are spontaneously assembled at the moment of confrontation with the violence of capital, but they are evanescent and they end up in defeat without leaving any trace. The question then is, what could shield insurgent utopias from the same fate of utopian fantasies? And this applies to not only the indigenous struggles in the Amazon against extraction, but to many of the uprisings that we have seen in the last few years. What could shield insurgent utopias from the same fate of utopian fantasies? How does insurgent utopia acquire its own positive self-reproducing conditions instead of only erupting from the confrontation with capital? And how does it, or can it, become permanent in the sense of being not only a fleeting moment, but also in the sense of resisting its capture by capital, resisting becoming itself an apparatus of capture, and resisting its paradoxical inversion, becoming its opposite through the process of its realization?
Are we leaving it there? Okay, then. So we stop with an open question. So I think that the best thing to do at this point is to see if there are any comments or questions from the floor, or and then maybe ask Japhy if he wants to say a few words about the comments to his book. But first, I would like to see a few hands up. Or even if you want to write your name in the chat, and then I'll call you. Yes, Angus, please go ahead. Hi.
Yeah, hi everybody, and thanks for 3 really excellent presentations. Just building on what Mazen finished, really provocative question. Building on that, thinking about like the state and whether it's possible to have a state without these kind of spectacles or without kind of concretizing kind of utopias. So I couldn't help think but of the Millennium Dome, which is a spectacle of the state in London that was built for a particular celebration that blew away in a storm. Yeah, and it just so happens that kind of like states that are in kind of like the capitalist core are better at concretizing their kind of utopian dreams than post-colonial states. And I wonder, and this is a question of like thinking about alternative state forms and kind of projects for the left, can you have state forms without having these spectacles that embody kind of utopias? And what type of state would that look like? So kind of extending Mazen's question to think about kind of the states in particular.
Thank you, Angus. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Gaia, go ahead. Gaia Striskantan, please. Yes. Okay, Gaia, you have your hand up. I don't know if there is any technical issue. I will call Alex Kalinikos in the meantime, and let me know if there is anything I can do. Oh no, are you there?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry about that. I think I had some issues with my microphone. Yeah, thanks so much to all the 3 presenters. It was really fascinating discussion. I had, was reflecting on some of the questions that Thea raised at the end about what the challenges are for global solidarity. And I'm just wondering if any of the speakers have any reflections on whether it actually might present opportunities for solidarity between communities in the global north and communities in the global south who might now be being subjected to similar types of extractive activities in the areas that they are. And I'm also, very curious about this question of it's a totally separate question of how global south countries that have depended on resource extraction for their sort of core economic activity, like how do we break out of this resource sort of like the prison of sort of like having the resource curse of a resource-based economy, and what sort of glimmers of hope and what kind of pathways out of that are we potentially seeing in some countries, maybe Ecuador being an example.
Thank you, Gaia, for the good questions. Alex?
Hi. 3 points. The first is a very quick one. Angus, I don't think it's at all true that so-called advanced capitalist states are necessarily better at kind of utopian constructions than those in the global south. Millennium Dome was notorious for naffness. The situationist poet Ian Sinclair sent it up magnificently when it was first constructed. So I don't think that that you can take that as an example of the utopian superiority of the advanced capitalist states. To Mazen, I'm really confused by some of the things that you said. I mean, I haven't read the book, but you make it sound really, really interesting, as Japhy did himself. But I don't understand how you can. I don't see how the Lacanian real and the and Deleuzean desiring production fit together. I'm confused about that. And if the kind of the benchmark of
Right.
the reality that is being displaced and so on and so forth, in all this utopian fantasizing is production, then whether conceived of as desiring production or life activity or whatever, how does that relate to what is the reality of labor in extractivist industries, particularly, although not exclusively, in the South? I'm in a tangle there. Maybe it's in my head, but I find that confusing. I think that the issues that Thea raises are really, really interesting and important ones, because they point to some of the contradictions of the way in which a green transition is being attempted within the framework of fossil capitalism. And I think this is a very rich and important theme for struggles in the South, but also for broader global solidarity. I mean, in some sense, the energy crisis that we're experiencing at the minute in Europe, which is being intensified, of course, by what's happening in Ukraine, is a consequence of I would say, a bastardized attempt at at a green transition, which involves increasing reliance on gas, and therefore, in the European context, on Russia. I mean, that's a geopolitical tension that is generated by this bastardized green transition. But it seems to me that Thea is identifying issues of huge importance, both analytically and politically. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, I think maybe I'll invite Hector Rios to, I see there are more hands up, so I just want to take one more question, which I think can help also kind of synthesize some of the topics. And well, I'm going to ask it for Hector, who is in a train, so cannot ask it himself. So he was wondering if the panelists can share some ideas or experiences about how the decolonial left and the developmental left can address the differences, or are we condemned to an impossible division that only helps the green capitalist transition? Okay, so I think we have quite a lot on the table. So Jörg, if you don't mind, I'll ask Japhy and Thea and Mazen to start answering these questions, and then we will have a second round of questions. Yeah, maybe briefly, not too long, because I think Thea needs to leave in 25 minutes. Do you want to start, Japhy?
Okay. Great questions. Thank you very much, and fantastic comments from both Thea and Mazen. Lots to think about. So yeah, I guess in the interest of time, I'll just focus on a couple of things. Angus's point about states at the core of the system apparently being more successful in concretizing their dreams. I'd agree with Alex in questioning that, and I think, Angus, the case of the Millennium Dome, as you point out, is a very apt one. But there are no doubt countless others. It's a question of doing the research. I've found in my own work that everywhere I've looked, state fantasies, and my work in Ecuador is only one of the places I've looked at. State fantasies that appear from a distance to be functioning very well once you get close to them and do the work and dig into them, invariably full of all kinds of contradictions. And this is equally the case for so-called developed states. Can't speak exactly to a state project in this regard, but my previous research prior to Ecuador was on a series of so-called Millennium Villages projects financed by multinational corporations and billionaire philanthropists, and implemented by the notorious development economist Japhy across various countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But this was a project emanating from the core of global capitalism in every respect, and it was absolutely as much of a farce as anything that I saw in Ecuador. So yeah, I don't think we can make that assumption about there being about core states being any more successful in implementing their utopias. Perhaps they're just more successful in projecting that success, that apparent appearance of success. In terms of what Gaia mentioned about, I think it was Gaia, about looking for glimmers of hope, pathways out. I think I'm probably not the best person to comment on that, because my sense increasingly is that we should perhaps, when confronted with the situations that make us feel like we really need to find glimmers of hope and pathways out, so I think that's often the temptation to escape from the real into a new fantasy, to put it in the crude Lacanian terms. And Zizek has a great line, which I always like to refer to in such contexts. He says, the light at the end of the tunnel is probably a train coming in the other direction. And his point is that we need, at a moment in which all apparent alternatives seem to end in dead ends, we need to perhaps stay with, as I suggest in my book, the things that don't make sense, and really and remain within the deadlock, rather than immediately look for the glimmers of hope.
Thank you, Japhy. Thea, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll address a couple great questions and presentation from Mazen, and also comments, further comments from Japhy. So I'm going to speak a bit to, I think, Gaia and Hector's questions. So Gaia, yes, is the short answer. I do think that the kind of increasingly planetary mind, to borrow Martín Arbeleda's very apt phrase, does present opportunities for coordinated anti-extractive activism that cuts across the uneven spatiality of extraction, and in a way, I mean, that sort of cuts across or in the other direction of globally unequal economic and ecological exchange, right? So just to put that in less jargony terms, I see in my research all the time, and increasingly, coordination and borrowing of strategies and tactics and knowledge between movements situated in Portugal, Serbia, Spain, the Southwest United States, Chile, Argentina, et cetera. And that's just in the lithium frontier, right? We could probably have a similar analysis of other extractive sectors that are linked to the energy transition, but for some interesting reasons, lithium has been a particularly fruitful place of really expansive global coalitions from below in opposition to rapacious extraction. So yes is the short answer. The slightly longer answer, that I won't actually make longer, but just to kind of hint at some of the subtleties here, are that, you know, movements in the global north face a really intense narrative from governments and corporations, which is twofold. One, that reshoring or onshoring supply chains is absolutely necessary for geopolitical hegemony, right? So that in order to defeat China, you know, we need to bring home, and this type of nationalism, precisely because of the way that it papers over class difference and who actually pays the costs and who bears the benefits of economic nationalism, precisely because it does so, if it's effective as a political narrative, it can create a cross-class kind of coalition, right? So that's a risk or a threat to global solidarity by sort of bringing global North movements into a sort of nationalism. The other, often paired with that, as I've observed in my research, is that mining is more sustainable, responsible, and ethical in the global North, which is not true, but is a powerful narrative of like regulatory, like kind of that there's better regulations in the global North, right? So movements in the global North, there's, I think, a lot of pitfalls that can undermine solidarity with the global South, but I see movements actually not being duped by those narratives, which is hopeful. Maybe counter Japhy's last point, that's maybe one source of hope, is these sort of transnational grassroots movements against transition-related mining. Let me say something briefly about extraction and post-extraction possibilities in the global South and Latin America particularly, which I think speaks a bit to Gaia and Hector's questions. And I want to give two very different scenarios. One more concerning and maybe pessimistic and maybe kind of resonates a bit with where Japhy ended, and one more maybe hopeful but also equally complex. So Ecuador and Chile, right? You know, in Ecuador's last presidential elections, the right wing came to power, as Japhy said in his talk. But you know, in addition to that terrible outcome, the left was divided on the ballot box, right? In exactly the way I discussed in my talk, there was an anti-extractive, anti-mining activist on the ballot, and there was also an heir to the Correa pink tide kind of, you know, more statist approach to extraction. And they ran against one another, right? And they actually got similar percentages in the first round, which is a clue that if there were potentially, and I understand that this might not be possible in the near term, but a sort of a left bloc that could encompass both, you know, sets of voters, we could have, you know, a left victory at the ballot box. But right now the left remains completely divided along the lines, as Hector put it, of, you know, a sort of decolonial anti-extractivism and a developmental kind of nationalism. So that's the, you know, concerning outcome in Ecuador. In Chile, we have what might appear at first glance to be a left-wing government, the incoming Gabriel Boric government on March 11th, that appeals to both and mobilizes both, you know, militant anti-extractive activists and those that, you know, are mobilized around other issues and might even support potentially a more state-led version of extraction. And what I'm very curious about is how Boric navigates this. And I'll end with just saying, you know, once he's in power, and I'll end with just saying this: he has promised to both establish a state-owned lithium company, and he has promised no more ecological and social sacrifice zones in Chile. Can you do both? Maybe. I mean, there could be a coherent theoretical argument to be made that state-led extraction could be less sacrificial, but there's an equally cogent argument that it's just as sacrificial, right? And so I'll leave it there, but I think that Latin America is the place to watch how these tensions play out, and the next few years will be very interesting, and I think also very challenging to the new crop of left-wing governments.
Thank you, Thea. Mazen, please go ahead.
Yeah, these are all very challenging and thought-provoking questions. I'll start with Angus's question as he rephrased it in the chat, which is, can you build progressive politics or state alternatives without these utopias or fantasies? And the short answer is yes. Indeed, what Japhy shows in his book is that, the way I read it, is that these utopias and fantasies are actually stifling of alternatives. They are co-optive of whatever alternatives may arise spontaneously or not. So yes, in a general sense, in fact, you can build such movements without or against, in fact, these utopias. I do not know if you can make a general argument about states and utopias, or states and utopias and monuments to their utopias. I was born and I grew up in a country which I am safe to say has never had utopian visions at the level of the state. I come from Lebanon, and if you have been following the news, you can take the Lebanese state as a very example of an extreme of what a state without utopian visions looks like. Which brings me to Alex's point. It's precisely my point that the Lacanian real and Deleuzean desire are not compatible at all. What I was offering is an alternative reading to the one that Japhy provides, instead of using the Lacanian categories or faculties of the real and fantasy. I was opposing fantasy to what Deleuze and Guattari call desire. And my turning to Marx was especially to underline the need to think, to restore something holistic to the notion of labor, not as labor that is appropriated by capital, but labor in its full sense, what Deleuze and Guattari call production in general, or what Marx calls life activity, or what a later Marx calls even labor capacity, not labor power, but potentiality, the capacity to produce, not only produce things, not only produce commodities for capital, but produce society, produce social life, produce human beings, produce communities, produce connections, so on and so forth. So that was my point in, that was my attempt to point to the possibility of restoring to the notion of labor its full sense. Gaia's question, I want to answer somewhat obliquely. In 1951, there was a debate in the General Assembly of the United Nations about sovereignty over natural resources. And the first drafts of resolutions that were passed eventually addressed the sovereignty of nations and peoples over natural resources. Within, I don't know how many drafts, not many, this transformed into state sovereignty over natural resources for obvious reasons, which is that a lot of states that have valuable natural resources have contentious relationships with peoples and nations. And to put the sovereignty of resources within nations and peoples would deprive the state of the legitimacy of claiming sovereignty over the natural resources within territories. And I think this is a question that needs to be addressed if we were to think about the possibilities of moving beyond the state control over natural resources, or thinking about alternative modes of access to those natural resources. Now, I want to say something about extraction. Extraction is somewhat thrown around, usually the taken for granted sense, as if it is clear what it refers to. But what are we talking about when we talk about extraction? Extraction of what? Because extraction is, some mode of extraction is necessary. Agriculture is a mode of extraction. And if we were to continue living as living organisms, we need to extract minerals from the soil in the form of edible and nutritious things. So this extraction is absolutely necessary. Some mode of extraction is necessary, as Thea mentioned, moving to a green economy. Some dirty extraction is happening because it is happening under the same conditions of the extraction of fossil fuels in the attempt to move quickly from a fossil fuel dependent capitalist economy to a green capitalist economy. And we have always to underline the capitalist extraction rather than extraction in general. So I'm not sure we can really move to a post-extractive society because some extraction is always necessary. And I understand that when we are talking about extraction here, we're talking specifically about capitalist extraction of fossil fuels. So we have to be very specific about what extraction we're talking about, not condemn extraction itself as a given for granted capitalist extraction of fossil fuels. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. Jörg, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi everybody. Great talk. Really important topic as well. I just wanted to ask what kind of commentary this book provides on capitalist culture, more directly, right? And then secondly, the notion of it doesn't make sense. How can we productively take that forward into maybe other areas of debate? Or so when you that's one of the big conclusions you have, right? And maybe also innovative contributions to the larger political economy literature, because not many scholars say that openly, right? In the field, that doesn't make sense, and that's a central finding, sort of. Like, but theoretically speaking, what do you do with that unit of analysis or that finding, basically, and where does it sit in the literature? How could I teach that? Do you see what I mean?
Thank you, Jörg. I have a few questions here. One from Hamza, who is also on a train or a bus and cannot ask it himself. And I just wanted to ask Ian Drummond, do you want to ask your question yourself, Ian, that you posted, the question you posted in the chat?
I could just read it out quickly, I guess.
You can also improvise, yeah, whatever.
I was just asking about the divided left in Ecuador. Is it not the case that the elephant in the room is that Yaku Perez, the indigenous anti-extractivist candidate referred to, wasn't really of the left at all? He was always on the right wing of the indigenous movement. I think he was always quite friendly towards the United States. And his whole project at the time of the election seemed to be to maximize the split between the indigenous movement and the citizens' revolution left to the benefit of the right. And since the election, which was only a few months ago, I've heard that he's already left the indigenous movement entirely. So I think that's a good example in the negative of how agency matters in a way, and that some of these things that don't make sense, maybe it's down to that kind of thing, the terrain of struggle. And I think just throwing up our hands and saying it's necessarily going to be a train coming towards us if it's light at the end of the tunnel, maybe see who's actually involved, what class forces, what individuals, what movements. But definitely in terms of Ecuador, I wouldn't say that there were two equally good left days on the ballot, even if there are two lefts. But one of the guys, I think, was deliberately trying to drive them apart for nefarious means, it seems.
Thank you so much, Ian, for this important question. I will read Hamza's question, and please let me know if there are any more hands or any more comments. Here, Hamza Hamushin, who also writes about extractivism and resistance in North Africa. I don't know if you have come across his work. So he's part of our group in contemporary Marxist theory. And he asks, Thea, you mentioned that the dilemmas between the urgency of the energy transition and climate catastrophe and protecting the livelihoods and environments of communities in extraction zones might necessitate another path for the transition in contrast to the current one. It would be great if you and the other speakers could elaborate on this. So the kind of transition that is necessary. So any other comments or questions? Yes, give me my pension back. You can go ahead.
My name's John. And I would also like my pension back. Okay, thanks everyone for their contributions. I guess my contribution is riffing off Angus's comment about the Millennium Dome, right? And it will make sense, we'll get there. So in some ways, I guess it's the question to Japhy, is the idea of the kind of state utopia itself an unequal amongst states? So the Millennium Dome is quite a good example, because I actually went to the Millennium Dome when it was actually the Millennium Dome and it had a big human body in it and things like this to celebrate the millennium. But then after it became like a white elephant, essentially private capital came in and saved it and turned it into an arena most of us go to now for music and sports and entertainment, and it's very profitable. So in that sense, are the dreams of states also kind of impacted by just essentially imperialism, right? Private capital comes in to save the Millennium Dome, and well, other states don't get that kind of benefactor because of their kind of place in the global economy. So is it unequal? I'm just thinking here about necessarily these are older debates about how the state manifests its utopian project. So the literature here has very much been a certain kind of Marxism, but if we go to a certain other kind of Marxism, like say Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, that it's in there about how you reimagine the state's utopian projects. I always think about Fanon's idea about what you should do with the National Sports Stadium, which doesn't seem, so kind of important in a book about essentially armed revolution, but actually is really important if you understand about the kind of post-colonial state. So that's just the kind of like, in a sense, how does imperialism in the global economy itself alter those utopias?
Thank you, John. Who wants to go first? Japhy, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if Thea would like to speak first. If you need to go.
So I think I'm gonna just try to stay for like
Great.
another 15 at least, and maybe that will give us time. But so I can go second or third or whatever.
That's great. Thank you, Thea. So maybe second, we follow the same order again.
First thing I should point out. First thing I should point out before I forget, Thea, you mentioned that planetary mind was Martin Arbeleider's concept, and that everyone I'm sure
You're
thinks
right.
that. Because,
Thank you. I just as soon as you said that, I'm like, you're absolutely right. Yes, we have the actual architect of that here. Just the place I first read it. I should have cited Mazen. Sorry to talk over you, but like as soon as I said that, I was like, oh, that's not true. But anyway, so it goes. But, thanks for the actual author in the room.
I just wanted to make sure Mazen got credit for that. Okay, cool. Now to get on to what I was to the questions. Jorg, great to finally meet you, by the way, after being in communication for a long time. How to theorize things that don't make sense. Well, this I would have spent pretty much the other half of my talk addressing if I'd had more time, but I don't really have time to go into it now, except to say that this is why I find the Lacanian approach so useful, and it's been a struggle for me to get to the point of kind of relinquishing the constant desire to make sense, and that's really what, as academics, that's what we're trained to do, right? We take a kind of messy reality and we extract some kind of sense from it, and to kind of relinquish that and to try to stay within that space of the absurd, of the disorienting, and work creatively with that has been a real challenge. But that's why I find the Lacanian approach so useful. And I also, by the way, Mazen, find what you were saying about Deleuze and desire potentially very productive as well. But yeah, how to bring, whether it's possible to work with those simultaneously because of the contradictions that exist within them. And while I can see the kind of the appeal of the Lacanian, of the Deleuzian approach in terms of bringing a kind of vitalist understanding of labor and so on into the understanding of struggle against capital, I wouldn't want to relinquish the Lacanian approach because it's so productive precisely in terms of making sense of things that don't make sense. Because Lacan is all about sort of Lacanian psychoanalysis is all about coping with understanding processes of the disintegration of reality, which is basically what a psychotic episode is. And then Zizek does great work in transposing this Lacan's understanding of individual breakdown onto the kind of social level. And so the move into a domain in which things have ceased to make sense is really what Lacan was all about, and why I found it so useful to work with him, and particularly with Zizek's interpretation of him. So that would be where I would start, Jorg, in terms of how to kind of locate this in the literature. And also, by the way, Michael Tausig's work, he's one of the few people that I think is doing this in a kind of more grounded, concrete way, and his work is excellent, I think. Question.
I mean, would you put this in UK IPE, right? I mean, your part of this is also IPE, isn't it? So where's this? How do you contribute to those debates I see, in the typical Visa IPAC workshops and all the rest of it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, Jorgen. To be honest, I don't. I mean, I've given up on IPE as on attempting to engage with IPE as a discipline because I find it incredibly frustrating. For lots of ways.
So it's outside those debates. It's outside
human geography. I find human geography so much a more constructive space in which to work because it's so much more open to doing all this kinds of stuff, and anthropology, and that's where Tausig is working. Ian's point about Jakub Perez. Yeah, I agree. I mean, Japhy Perez is a contradictory character, and there's all kinds of criticisms that could be made of the way in which he handled his candidacy and ambiguities in his position in relation to the indigenous movement and so on. I did see him when I was in Ecuador, and there were demonstrations against the neoliberalizing constitutional reforms that Correa was bringing in 2016. I did see Japhy Perez actually getting the shit kicked out of him by a bunch of cops during that demonstration, who's obviously clearly being targeted by the regime. And I suppose it's a common move from the kind of from the other side of the left to blame Japhy Perez for Andrés Arauz's defeat, but I think Andrés Arauz was very much seen as the inheritor of the Correa legacy, and in fact that's how he presented himself, and that was the problem. The kinds of repressions of indigenous movements, and not just indigenous movements, by the way, but subaltern movements of various kinds that Thea discusses in her book, and that I also discuss in mine, by the Correa regime throughout his period in office, right from the start. Those kinds of repressions aren't easily forgiven or forgotten, and so I think that was chickens coming home to roost for the citizens' revolution. Really, I don't think it can be blamed on anyone other than themselves. And in terms of you problematized my admittedly slightly glib use of Zizek's mention of the light at the end of the tunnel being a train coming towards us. Fair enough. What I actually mean by that, and as Mazen has mentioned, I didn't get a chance to talk about in my talk, but I would have had more time. A quite significant part of my book is actually about what I call insurgent utopias, which I contrast with what I call the utopian fantasies of the extractivist state, in either its neoliberal or post-neoliberal guise. And insurgent utopias erupt precisely, I suggest, in contexts in which there is no visible or imaginable horizon of hope. And it's precisely that loss of hope and that sense of being trapped in a deadlock in which there is no horizon of hope that can result in an explosion of radical political energy that can actually affect a great deal more transformation than a kind of the pursuit of another hope-filled dream. And John, on the Millennium Dome, I know I've taken a lot of time, so I'll just say something very quickly about this. Yes, totally agree. Imperialism gets tangled up with these processes, or at least global capital accumulation ends up appropriating these utopias in various ways. And one of the ways this happens, I talk about in the book, is the interoceanic corridor that I was discussing, that ended up completely failing in terms of its stated goals, but at the same time providing precisely the economic infrastructure that the transnational oil industry needed in order to take advantage of the new oil blocks being opened in the Yasuni National Park. So that was an example again of how I say somewhere in the book something along the lines of these fantasies succeed precisely in the process of their failure. In other words, they succeed in guaranteeing the conditions of capital accumulation precisely to the extent that they fail to meet their stated objectives. And I think the role of global capital accumulation, and what I call the reel of capital, in that is absolutely central.
Thanks for another great set of questions, and I'll just touch on a couple topics that pertain to things I know something about. So I concur for the most part, I think, with Japhy's discussion of the recent elections in Ecuador. And maybe a slightly different way to phrase it is like, aside from Japhy Perez's sort of particular political biography and positions he's taken, and sometimes outright courting of the right, which I think he can be critiqued for. I think, sort of aside from that, the idiosyncrasies of his politics, this divide exists, right? And like some dialogue, organizing, something would need to overcome it, and neither his campaign nor Arauz's campaign did. Though I will say that, and I don't know if Japhy and I disagree here, or this is just an artifact of, a quick analysis. I think that Arauz tried, though insufficiently, for sure, but tried to distinguish himself from Correa at the same time that he used Correa's legacy as campaign marketing, right? So he kind of had a contradictory politics there too, which is like everything you loved about Correa, but not what you didn't like, right? Which is kind of a hard sell maybe, and it worked, but it also faced its limit. I mean, it worked insofar as he, obviously got many votes and made it to the second round, but ultimately it didn't work. And then, I think it's also, we shouldn't though, and I think Japhy would agree here, just talk about this through political figures, but through broader social forces, right? So the CONAI, the National Indigenous Federation, their own popular internal vote on what to do about the elections was basically to sit it out, to endorse a null vote, and which many of their members actually did, which is extraordinary discipline. I mean, they made this decision and then their members carried it out, because I think that there was one of the highest rates of null votes, like, maybe ever or recently in an election in Ecuador. So, there are multiple forces that resulted in Lasso winning, and I don't think, attributing it to the decisions or idiosyncrasies of one leader is sufficient. That being said, the critiques of some of Yaku, I think are valid. Let me go quickly to Gaia's question, which we don't, I think, have the space to really, or maybe even the tools or all the folks on a panel that you would want to kind of understand, like, what is the Global South's way out of extractivism? Like, that's just an enormous question. Japhy addressed it in part, and maybe sort of finding some critical and radical energies in the failure of those projects, right? And so that's one way to think about it, in the failure of left extractivism. But what else is available to governments that are currently, and to the movements pressuring them that are currently in power in Latin America? I mentioned a bit of what Boric in Chile is trying to do, and maybe the internal contradictions of it. But I think, like, one of the things that makes this question so thorny, and maybe both Japhy and Mazen might agree with me here, which is that I don't think that they can be addressed at the level of the nation state, right? I really like Mazen's comment about a bit of the ideological mystification of the nation state itself, and the fact that actually, and even explicitly, like, Ecuador is a plurinational state. There are distinctions between nations, indigenous nations, other nations, the state, but also other popular movements, and we should sort of pry those apart and analyze them in terms of resource governance. But there's also a scale above the nation state, right? Which is to say that I think, a country like Ecuador, given the location it's in the global economy, is not equipped, and this has nothing to do with a lack of domestic expertise or the usual kind of World Bank explanations for why Ecuador is in the position it's in, but literally, like, is in competition with its neighbors to attract extractive capital, right? Which just means that the solidarity, the transnational global South solidarity, and I'm sort of explicitly recalling, like, the new international economic order and the ideas between the 1950s and 1970s for a fundamental restructuring of the global economy that would sort of put commodity exporters into a position of some power over extractive sectors. Like, something like that would be required. So, what would it look like? And maybe this is just as much of a hopeful or a fantasy or a utopia of the sort that we've been critiquing, but, what would it look like for left-wing governments to explicitly coordinate over, for example, bargaining with multinational companies, over refusing to pay debt, that is so unsustainable and illegitimate, the sovereign debt rates that afflict global South governments. But this would require some coordination, or else you sort of fall into that unevenness of global capitalism, and global South countries are pitted against one another. So I would see maybe some interesting ideas coming out of the front runner in Colombia's upcoming elections, the left-wing front runner Petro, that he has an idea for an anti-fossil fuel coalition of global South or Latin America and global South governments that Boric has also, I think, co-signed. So again, sort of the transnational scale or the regional scale, I think, offers some ways out that the nation state scale absolutely forecloses. And just really much more briefly on the other question about like what would a different renewable energy transition look like. I mean, I feel like I don't want to take too much, and I want to really turn it over to Mazen, because this is another big question. But you know, basically all of the problems with the extractive foundations of fossil capitalism, aside from you know the you know runaway emissions part, perhaps, are being reproduced in the current organization of quote green capitalism or you know for the renewable energy sector, which is a form of very unequal, individualized private consumption that is extremely resource intensive. You know, so just to make it very clear, like the idea that the way that we decarbonize the transportation sector is that everyone owns a Tesla is not only unattainable, speaking of utopias, I mean, like most people in the world are not going to be able to afford a Tesla, but is also extremely, extremely predatory and rapacious in terms of the extractive supply chains it requires, right? And so I think that there is an opening to think in terms of, you know, what would collective consumption, what would massified and public forms of leisure, you know, look like as an alternative that, and again, I really just want to underscore Mazen's amazing, like very important point about extraction. Like, yes, an electric bus requires extraction, but it requires much less than the same amount of cars, you know, per person instead of taking that bus. So I do think there's, you know, this requires just rethinking prevailing modes of consumption and production, and you know, which have just a specific resource footprint. And so, yeah, it requires that type of analysis. I don't think we can solve it just at the front lines of extraction. We have to go further down the supply chain and look at what shapes the rate, volume, and governance of extraction. You know, big and kind of answer that leaves more questions maybe than it addresses, but that's the kind of way that I think about it. So let me turn it over to Mazen.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to largely agree with you, Thea, and I want to take another jab at answering Gaia's question. And I think you can answer it in two ways. The first is to really just describe processes that are going on within the given mode of organization. So moving from dependence on extractivism or on extractive industry could take the shape that has been taking on perhaps for the last 20 years. If you look at oil producing countries in the Middle East that have been forming sovereign wealth funds that concentrate oil rents into funds that are being invested in other modes of production that are non-extractive. Actually, while reading Japhy's book, one figure kept haunting me. The stupid figure of Mohammed bin Salman and his attempt to transform Saudi Arabia into a kind of financial center, while going on to produce 11 million barrels of oil every day. So this is a mode of transition beyond dependence by states, by oil or extractive dependent states, beyond extractivism, at the same time that they continue to pump oil and gas and coal into the system. So this is one mode of transition that is happening within the confines of the global capitalist system, and it's happening, and probably maybe it will produce something. But you know, Norway is a good example of an oil state that has really managed to diversify away from oil by investing in sovereign wealth funds, but they are still producing fossil fuels, and the oil and gas networks are so vast and so militarized that it is almost impossible to imagine an immediate solution to just getting rid of them. Not only that so many states and so many corporations and so much capital is invested in them, but they are so militarized, they are so protected that any notion of, you know, even physically attacking the network is quite delusional. And, you know, I don't want to end it on this very pessimistic note, but it's a conundrum. How do we get rid of it is a conundrum. You know, from the climate perspective, from the, you know, there's always concentration on climate, but the fossil fuel capitalist system is so much more violent in many different ways the oil spills, pollution, the violence against indigenous communities, the violence against any kind of communities, the whole network is infused with violence that circulates with the fuels and with the capital that keeps being invested in it. So I don't know what's the way out of it, which brings me to the other way of looking at it, which is what I meant by my first comment about extraction, which is that you cannot pose this question without putting it in the context of anti-capitalist struggles, because it's it's a capitalist dream, in fact, to get beyond extractivism. In fact, the account that Japhy gives about the ICAM, the university in the Amazon, that was supposed to liberate the state from dependence on finite fossil fuels to the exploitation of an infinite resource, which is the biodiversity of the Amazon, or knowledge as an abstract resource, is not very far from what actually certain capitalist concerns have been engaged in. And this is something that I have addressed in my work on the planetary mind. And by the way, Martin is my brother, so the concept is in the family. I called it a capitalist wet dream. The notion of this delusional notion of the circular economy, for example, the perpetual reproduction of capitalism beyond the exhaustion of resources or the earth itself, into something that just reproduces itself with the recycling of materials, which is another way, of like thinking, maybe the problem is not just getting rid of fossil fuels, but we have to keep the focus on really exiting, if not directly destroying, but exiting the capitalist mode of production by whichever means, by digging tunnels out of it, by living against it, as some people have been thinking about, alternative modes of production and reproduction within the capitalist system as a way of negating it. And I feel that we can look at the transnational or the planetary scale, but we can also look at the molecular processes that are actually taking place everywhere. Most people in the world live in communist relationships within the predominant capitalist system, in the relationships that are not market mediated. A lot, otherwise they would not be able to live. What Japhy calls insurgent utopias, I have personally experienced firsthand when I lived throughout the Civil War, in which at moments people just, became communist. They shared without expectation of anything in return. Resources were shared, time was shared, care was shared, and these exist everywhere in the world. Most people live communistically, even if they are dependent in the end on some money income to buy their necessities. But otherwise, most people would not be able to live if they did not have these alternatives mode of living. And I think that there is hope in looking at these molecular processes and these cases of people living against capital, not just living outside of capitalist relations. So I think, just to summarize everything, a transition out of extractivism for me does not make sense if it is not always coupled with the question of transition out of the capitalist system, of the capitalist mode of production and reproduction, of capitalists' lien on life. And this is perhaps also why I came back to the question of desiring production, a life activity that remains outside of capital and absolutely untrapped by capital.
Well, I think this is the right note to finish with. I want to thank everyone for the great discussion. Thank you, Thea, for staying longer than you planned. Thank you, Japhy. Thank you, Mazen. And yeah, let's hope that we can build on existing struggles and solidarities to meet again in an utopia that we can actually realize. So see you next time, hopefully in better times. And thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. That was amazing. Thanks very much, Thea, Mazen, and Japhy. Bye.
And
Thanks.
thank you, Alex. I forgot for organizing most of this seminar. Thank you, Alex. Bye.
Pleasure. Bye. Bye. Thanks, all the speakers.